Hi, and welcome to the Improvisers podcast. I'm Kevin James, and this is my co-host, Neil Thomas.
Thank you, Kevin. Here on the Improvisers podcast, we talk with performers about their histories, their practices, the conceptualizations around their practices, and their future aspirations. Who are we in conversation with today, Kevin?
Today, Neil, I'm so excited to say we've an opportunity to chat with Reuben Lewis. Reuben spoke of receiving his first trumpet at 8 years of age, with lessons to come much later. He mentioned his current ensemble, I Hold the Lion's Paw, and also considered his doctoral focus on contemporary trance practices.
He talks of the new space that the birth of his twins have created for him, and the Instagram project that he and his partner created during lockdown. The world died today while you were on the phone. And he speaks lovingly of the various mentors, past and present, who have supported him through his artistic journey.
Yeah, we hope that you enjoy this interview as much as we did. Let's go.
Good morning and hello, Reuben Lewis. Thank you so much for joining us on this morning's Improvisers podcast.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Maybe we'll start today's podcast with the perennial question: when did you and music come together, and how did improvisation enter into that mix?
I would say that music has been part of my life from day dot. I came from a artistic family, so I would consider myself a second generation artist in my family, which I think is an important qualifier when it comes to this stuff. My mother's a visual artist, was a blues singer as well. Her medium is more print and drawing and painting. My dad is a guitarist and woodworker, studied in sculpture as well. My brother studied a film degree and, does music as well. So I had a lot of music in the family and a lot of art in the family. So I feel like I was allowed to explore from day dot and wasn't given any sort of, resistance towards that. The journey was my own. And I think when it comes to improvisation, if I think about it deeply, it wasn't improvisation to start with. It was more a freedom to explore and a permission to find my own path. And that comes with, a career sense or a, maturement sense as well. And I was lucky enough to get a lot of, positive feedback and space to work from day dot. So, I picked up the trumpet when I was 8 years old in primary school. All the teachers around me let me kind of go feral with it and play around and have fun. My parents never pushed me to do lessons, so to speak. They just let me play, and they knew that once I was ready, I would take on lessons. And so throughout my entire high school period, I was starting bands, doing concerts, running, little events every Friday in the courtyard, that kind of stuff. I had a very supportive public music school upbringing in Canberra. One of those schools where, there were 800 kids when I started and half of them did music. And by the time I finished, there were 1,000 kids and there were 700 people doing music. So it was a really big, active music program. So the music teachers there were very, pivotal for me in terms of giving me space to create. But I think maybe where the idea solidified more would have been when I was 15 and I got my first trumpet teacher. So my first trumpet teacher was Miroslav Bukovsky, who was a wonderful composer, improviser, jazz trumpet player, experimental artist, mentor. He used to be head of trumpet and composition, I guess, in the jazz school at the ANU. And I still I still remember the first time we met. I was given his number by one of the teachers who said, "You've got to talk to Miroslav. You must, get lessons with this person." I was like, "Okay, cool, sounds cool." And the first thing he said to me was, "Oh, this is all wrong. We have to fix this." And I found that quite confronting. But what I realize now is that he's such a passionate and caring person. So when he sees something he can fix, not fix, but support better, he's really intense about it. He really goes into it. So I think we started off with a very strong, clear relationship. And I remember from almost the second or third lesson, I was not just getting trumpet lessons, but getting composition lessons and improvisation lessons and creativity exploration and expansion. So, I would bring in little scraps of material that I'd written on Sibelius that sounded like, crappy funk grooves, and he would, sit at the piano and make them into these little magic bits of music. And, I didn't know what was going on, but I really enjoyed it. So I think from a very early age, I was given those spaces to really craft an identity. And I think obviously there's other structures around that, but I think that's sort of where the idea of improvisation came in, was that I can explore things without the need to fit a mold or do something correctly. It's more about forming an identity and making that the sort of point of reference. So yeah, I think from there, I managed to craft a bit of a sense of myself before I hit university. And then, of course, the university system gives you different sort of things to bounce off and resist against and whatnot. But I think throughout all of that, there was this really caring and nurturing sense from my mentors. And, I'm the kind of person who loves the mentor. I find them and seek them out at every point in my journey in some way. Often they go from mentor to collaborator and back again. And so I think I've been really lucky to find those characters across my journey, and that's given me room to think about improvisation in a lot of different ways, from being a reactive sense to being a leadership model to being a constructive space to being something I can organize principles from, even from an academic sense, like understanding how improvisation can be sort of a way of constructing and composing as well as just being a way to respond. I think that's sort of where I'm going with it.
Reuben, when you mentioned about something with which to respond, I watched you perform on numerous occasions, and I was just pondering as you were speaking that I, as a performer, as an improviser, there's a sense that you're not hesitating. There's no hesitant. It's as though you're leaning into it, and things just happen, and you've got a type of a commitment and a very solid way of being present and being there in the process. So I just wanted to somehow confirm that. I also want to commend your website to anybody who's listening as a way of sort of accessing the breadth of your practices, and I think it's remarkable what you've achieved and what you've done. I'd like to just ask you a question regarding an article that you wrote called "The Aesthetics of Imperfection in Music and the Arts: Spontaneity, Flaws, and the Unfinished." I wonder if you can just sort of speak about that, broaden that, and use it as a means of speaking about improvisation as a process and as a form and as a practice that's worthy of committing to.
Sure. Well, first, thank you. That's very lovely words and very kind of you to say. On the website, I think it's worth saying that I'm a big fan of archives. I love the idea of documenting practice, and I think improvisation is a journey and a process that is ongoing. So if anyone who spends time documenting and keeping those records in a public fashion, such as this podcast, I think is a really commendable effort. And I think those characters really embed a history of geography and personality and everything else. So it's really important to have those spaces, and I feel like I really want to keep that in my own work. So thank you for that. And yeah, in terms of the article, yeah, that was a really beautiful moment for me. That article, that's the title of a book, in fact. So it's a collection of essays from improvisers from around the world, speaking to the point of the aesthetics of imperfection. So my take on that was, at the time of being asked to submit something to that book, I was working on an album with another local improviser called David Brown, aka Candle Snuffer. And David Brown is one of the hidden gems, I think, of the world, really. He's a extraordinary improviser, thinker, maker, academic in his own right, but also, his day job is renovating a pub, so he's such a interesting character, and he's brought so much to the improvising world, and is sort of his praises aren't sung loud enough, I don't think. But we had a beautiful duo collaboration called Stone Echidna, and we were just in the process of finishing up the record for that collaboration. And so when I was asked to submit something to that article or that book, I wanted to interview Dave and have a conversation with him about his process, because I feel like Dave has taught me a lot about how to bring different elements of improvisation structures together. I've worked with him in a lot of different formats. We haven't worked together for a while because of life, things have happened in between, but we worked very closely with my ensemble I hold the Lion's Paw, but then also in this duo context. And what I love about Dave's work is that he brings such a breadth of influence and structural understanding to what collaboration and improvisation mean. And it's entirely from a different world in terms of what perfection is, or what perfect is, or what what is valued in that moment. So I had this beautiful experience with him where the first time we really played together was no, sorry, I'll backtrack. The first time I heard him play was in Melbourne at a venue called Conduit Arts, which was on Brunswick Street, no longer there, unfortunately. But that was a beautiful period of time where there was this coming together of lots of different worlds, in a sense like Make It Up Club, but a few different sets of influences. But I remember seeing him play, I think it was hollow body 4-string guitar solo, and I remember every sound he made was like someone hitting an anvil. It was just this huge drop of weight and intensity and power, but it was nothing to do with volume or dissonance or intensity. It was just something about his he would just gather up every ounce of energy and just drop this thing into it. And I feel like I've only seen really Dave and Jim Denley have this power in their improvisational practice, where they can harness all of the energies and structures in the world and just drop it in. And it's not about necessarily a defined form that is, outside of their own world. So I feel like Dave has taught me how to look at things with different structures and look at bringing different ideas together and different, tonal qualities, historical qualities, relational qualities together, and knowing how to sort of work them through. So that interview was really just me asking some preliminary questions about that, because I was still in the process of understanding how his process works and also how he thinks about his music. I think for me, I like to find spaces where I can be challenged and be sort of, I guess I love to be able to put my aesthetics in a room with different aesthetics and see what comes out of it. So a lot of my improvisational process is actually about curation and about band leading. So when I think of someone like Dave, I've probably made him feel quite uncomfortable in a few different contexts, because I put him in spaces that he wouldn't necessarily be in. But part of my job in that space has been to give enough sort of room for different identities to move, but also try and bring some sort of unifying factor to it. So I guess that article was kind of the beginnings of, or a different sort of phase of understanding what that really means for me.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit more. It's slightly more specific, but I was interested in the phrase improvisational structures.
Sure. That's quite a big one. I guess for context, academically, I've been thinking about that idea a lot. And, from a collaborative standpoint as well, I feel like there's a few different threads you can pull from that particular phrase. So I'll try and unpack it a little bit. But in an academic sense, I've been sort of slowly journeying through that from a few different angles. So the end of my undergraduate studies, my honours year, was talking about notation for improvisers, learning how different forms of structuring things through notation can be enabling or disabling qualities in the improvising ensemble. So looking at people like John Cage and Anthony Braxton and Wadada Leo Smith, as well as doing a lot of experiments in the room with people, just trying to understand how we can use a structural principle, say a notation or graphic notation, to give improvisers, you know, not so much give them prompts, but understand what those prompts do, you know. So I think what I learned so much in that initial process was that as a composer or as a person who is implementing structure within an improvisational arena, there's so much more than just the notation or just the instruction you're giving. It's the impact of that or the impact of not giving it. You know, you can. You know, my trumpet teacher Miroslav said something really beautiful at that moment. He was saying that you know, never forget that as a composer or a band leader, you're inviting people in. You're inviting people to your space. So try not to offend them. You know, which I think is different to make them happy. I think the idea is not to necessarily make them, you know, entirely comfortable and cozy and do what they want, but it's about being offering that space with grace and understanding of what you're doing. You know, you want to be able to move things around without unnecessarily putting up barriers or putting up resistance to new ideas to form. So that was the first element of that. And then in my master's research, I was looking at that in a more retrospective sense. So I have an ensemble called I Hold the Lion's Paw, which has kind of been my big sort of creative focus as a band leader and as an ensemble leader. And that's gone through quite a few different phases. And in the initial phase was kind of stepping forward from that point of like, okay, so if I bring people into a room as a band leader composer, but the premise here is group improvisation, group interaction, and group expression. What is my role? How do I understand what I'm doing here, and how do I make the most out of it? So, you know, I guess for me, when it comes to structures outside of purely interacting, so compositional structures, band leading structures, improvising structures, I'm often more interested in what might happen rather than what I think is going to happen. So a lot of it kind of comes from that idea of like, okay, well, if I bring in this sort of, you know, this notated framework, what if I open up the edges so it can move somewhere else? You know, so a lot of the master's research was kind of experimenting with a longer process of working with a band with a series of influences and interests, and just sort of understanding how both the relational structures work, but also how individual choices can be made there. So, you know, a lot of what I'm looking at in an academic framework is trying to understand those nuances. So when I walk into the space as a leader, how do I have a soft approach? How do I have a soft sense of leadership that is both supportive but also not passive in that sort of space? So that's probably, you know, I'm at the beginnings of my PhD research, which goes a bit deeper into that in a different frame. But I feel like that's when I think of improvisational structures, I'm really sort of coming from that idea of, you know, there's more to this than just playing, than just responding. There's an active sort of role that I put myself in quite a lot just by nature. I like to be, I like to initiate things. I like to start groups. I like to start, you know, start action. So there's a responsibility there to understand exactly what I'm doing and what the ramifications of those actions can be. And so when it comes to a relational sense or a collaborative sense, I guess I'm always, because of that research, I'm always aware that there is an impact that I have in the room that is not just me responding. It's also how I stand in the space, what I say, what I don't say, how tired I am, what else is going on, who's not organized what, you know, so these sorts of like other things that can impact the space. And I think sometimes I actively try to work through them, or at least I just try and understand them so I can kind of be able to, you know, I guess eventually be quite free in that space. A bit of a ramble, but I think we're getting somewhere.
Reuben, I'm wondering because you've done so much work with dancers in the
Mm,
past, quite a lot with Tony Yap,
mhm,
with Yumi, with Tucker, with others.
mm,
I'm wondering how working with dancers, movers, modifies what you just said about collaboration.
mm,
And I remember you at Dance House in an Our Pieces once where we had about 20 dancers and you were the only sound person. Um, and yeah, so talk a little about that of working with dancers and how that modifies maybe the type of collaboration and what sound making implies then?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I guess I'll elaborate further, but I feel a quick summary about it is that working across mediums is a perfect example of what I'm talking about because if I'm working music to music, especially if I'm working within a sort of known, agreed upon genre space, there are so many structures and so many frameworks that you understand and that you can communicate through, which is good and bad. It has its own connotations. But when you are suddenly put into a situation where you're working in an entirely different space, a physical medium, all of a sudden those structures mean nothing, in the initial sense, or they not necessarily they mean nothing, but they mean something different, and it's your job to try and connect those threads again. For me, the first time I experienced that was when I visited Indonesia for the first time with some dear friends. We went over and just did a couple of concerts with some locals that my a dear friend had been working with for a couple of years, and I remember. I was very green at that point, and I just remember this experience of having improvisation with a few of the musicians there and realizing that none of my I called them like sort of blue chip movements were working. Like, I'd pull out this thing that I knew would work in every other context I've been in before, and it just didn't do anything. It just sort of lay flat. And I was like, oh, okay, there's something here that I should have been aware of, or I did know, but I didn't actually articulate properly in my mind, which is that it doesn't matter what I'm coming in with. If I'm not aware of what's going on in the moment, I'm not trying to seek those structures, then I'm just, I'm pissing in the wind at this point. And so I think when it comes to movement, I'm endlessly fascinated with that space. And I think what I love about dance in particular is that by nature of the form, you're often working with not just the dance form, but you're working with a lot of different mediums. If you're going into the full hog, you're doing lighting, you're doing dramaturge, you're doing sound, you're doing physical practice, so it has a sort of ability to immediately cross-pollinate. And so I think for me, the way I landed in that space was really just how I always do. I was just endlessly fascinated about the form and sort of ended up there. I have Ren Walters to thank for that, I'm pretty sure. So for context, I'm a Canberra native. I studied in Canberra at ANU, graduated in 2011. I went to Berlin for a year and got deep into the improvised music scene there. Basically just sort of spun around for a while and had a really great time and really started to understand that this was my world, this was my form, but also got to see a lot of people who are 40, 50, 60 with families, happy and healthy and loving what they're doing. And that was actually quite an affirming thing as a 20-something-year-old being like, oh yeah, you can live a happy life and do this. As silly as it sounds, it does mean something to get that confirmation when you're doing this sort of form. So I was there for a year. I came back to Australia and wanted to move to Melbourne for a collection of different things. NAM is a particularly potent space for a lot of different forms, I find. And it's very unique within the global sense, I feel, because there's a level of remoteness, but there's also a level of intensity and variety here that I haven't experienced in many other places. A lot of people love to cross-pollinate as well, which is exactly what I love to do. So I spent a lot of time flitting across the jazz scene, the improv scene, the new music scene, working with different collaborators. And along the way, I ran into Ren, probably at some series of improvising events. At that time, I didn't realize his lineage. I didn't realize he was coming from a jazz space as well. I knew him as a sort of very deep thinking, very intensely focused improviser. This was the period of time where he was going through his master's and PhD research into this ensemble, General Assembly of Instrument Parties, current, those sorts of curational events where he was really breaking up the framework of what improvisation and structures mean. So I was all for it. So I remember I went to a couple of current events and really just loved the format of, one dancer, two musicians, or one musician, two dancers, or whatever. I think I did one of those with Suki Burgine, I'm pretty sure, at that time, which was a lot of fun. I may have done, that's right, I did a couple of these ensembles as well. So there was a period of time where he was doing these sort of 3 or 4 hour marathons at Cross Street in Brunswick East with puppetry and music and spoken word and all this sort of stuff. And then I was also part of the General Assembly a few times. So I remember I was part of one of the general assemblies at Testing Grounds behind the Art Centre, and that's where I first ran into Tony. And I didn't know who Tony was, but I remember seeing him perform as a trio, and I just remember seeing it and realizing that whatever it was, I wanted to get involved in that. I just thought I don't know what it is, but it's speaking to me. It's giving me some sort of electricity and intensity that I really want to understand. So I essentially just bailed him up and said, "Hey, I want to play with you. I want to do some stuff." And as Tony is, he goes, "Okay, let's do it." And that was late 2014, I think, and by 2015 we were playing together. We did a concert in Fed Square with Brendan O'Connor and Scott McConaughey as well as a quartet. And I remember at that concert, halfway through it, just going, okay, I'm in this situation again where like none of my blue chip movements are working. Like it's not vibing, and it's not because of any lack in any ensemble member. It's just that I don't understand what's going on here, and I need to understand something else in order to make this a richer experience. And so I went into, I actually called that year kind of a personal investment year in a certain way. So I spent a lot of time going to residencies, going to different retreats, and really just kind of digging deep into a sort of consciousness expanding practice, so to speak. So I followed Tony to New Delhi and went to one of his residencies there, and then followed on to Mat Festival in Malacca. And for most of the Delhi residency, I didn't actually play trumpet at all. I spent most of the time dancing, because as we know, Tony Yap is a beautiful teacher and a beautiful mentor as well. And I just felt that whatever was going on, I think I wanted to spend a bit of time in a different structural practice to understand what the connecting points were. And so I basically got deep into his workshops and slowly extracted myself into more of a music role again. Cue a couple of years of doing a lot more movement slash trumpet performing spaces. And I feel like every time I go back to Tony now, there's a different level of both sort of stepping back into a music space and a curational musical sense, but also understanding what those physical parameters are. So it's funny with Tony because I feel like these days we often don't even look at each other. We don't even necessarily have to say anything. We just sort of, part of the challenge with Tony is that we get to the collaboration point, development point, we go, oh, we could just do this tomorrow and it would be fine. We have this sort of really deep, open, responsive space. But it does come from that research area of like, we need to actually have some sort of, I need to understand what these connecting points are and expand from that. I will say one more thing just on that point, because I think Tony's practice is definitely a pivotal moment for me. But I will also mention Lillian Steiner in this moment as well. I was very fortunate to work with Lillian Steiner for her Kia Choreographic Award commission in 2018, Memoirs for Rivers and a Dictator. She approached me because she wanted to have a trumpet in her piece. She was really interested in, the physicality of it, the metal, the industrial sort of sense of it. And when she realized that I had quite a large sort of, palette of sound making work as well as a keenness to move, I ended up really going deep into the sound structure of it as well as the physical parameters of it. So Marco Shegabad was the sound designer for that work. He recorded me improvising on my trumpet in all sorts of ways, so very industrial and noise-based as well as more sort of standard trumpet spaces. And the whole soundtrack was basically my trumpet reimagined in a different space. And then I was performing live and dancing in the work as well. And I mentioned that work because I think that solidified my love of the dance form in a broader sense as well, because whilst my work with Tony is very deep and sort of connects to my PhD research, it's a form that can exist outside of your black box space as well. And often, especially in those early stages, he was far more interested in working in community, outdoors, site-specific spaces. There's a whole different sort of focus there. Whereas Lillian's work was a tourable work. We did it in France the next year and performed it in Dance Master the year after. So it's a very, contemporary dance structure form. And I just had such a good time doing that work. Not only because Lillian is amazing, but her team was great. Marco was amazing. Jenny Hector was doing lighting. And I just remember the joy of being in a room with four powerhouse artists, looking at the same problem or the same, provocation, and being, how do we make this? And just loving how all these different perspectives could shape and shift and move things around. So I feel like that was such a beautiful point of memory for me that has kind of sustained me in terms of how I think about my other work. And when I start to work into the dance space as well, and also just going back to straight up music as well, it's a really beautiful thing to have in my mind.
I've got a sideways request.
Of course.
Just picked off your website off the Instagram work. I just love this title. The world died today while you were on your phone. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that. Yeah.
Beautiful. I'm so glad you found that one. I love that one. So the context around that work, it's a duo work. It's a work with my partner, Emily Bennett, who is a amazing singer, poet, spoken word artist, mover, extraordinaire. She works in my ensemble I hold the lines for as well. She's also the mother of my two gorgeous twins as well. So we have a very strong, long long history together. But ironically, we haven't spent a whole lot of time at that point. We hadn't spent a whole lot of time making music together. So that was one of the early collaborative points that we worked with. It was also a project that started in the 2020 bushfires in Canberra and finished in the NAM lockdowns over whatever year that was. But it was a two-stage project. And I guess there were a few different factors at play there. Contextually, it was a very tumultuous time for everybody. This was a way to make some music and to make some work in our own homes. It also was the start of a very sort of the early stages of a very sort of key part of my work now, which is studio production and studio work, and making improvised music within a recorded format as well. So the whole thing was recorded at home, produced at home. We were sort of enjoying the idea of smaller packets of ideas, and I think the social media thing was very present at the time because lockdowns. I think the way of how social media is being used or was being used at the time was shifting, with firstly sort of the raging bushfires across Australia, but also the way people had to come into a digital form, whether they liked it or not, over lockdown times. So it was a way for us to look at that format and have fun with it and just sort of play and experiment. And also, I think my musical aesthetics and Emily's aesthetics, we do have a love for, produced electronic music in a quirky way. We're both very intense improvisers and we like to play with form, but there is a love of like, if something is produced well or has a sort of really rich sense in that way, we appreciate it and we like it. So we like to mess with it. So the structure of that work was pretty simple. There was the first volume was 12 1-minute works, all at 120 BPM. The second volume was 9 works, all at 90 BPM, 1 minute long. The 1 minute format was purely just because Instagram could only go for 1 minute at a time. This was in the era before Reels, so everything had to be a square or a 4:5 ratio in terms of the video work as well. So I think it was just it was a really great time to kind of just pull those things together and just have some fun with it. And for me, apart from solidifying a really interesting collaborative space with my partner that was outside of my particular project that I hold the lines for or anything else, it was also a great way to dip into studio production in a new way. The way I like to make my work, it doesn't really matter which project it is, it kind of follows through in every one of them, is when it comes to a studio space, I like that to be a completely not clean, but open lab environment. So often I'll walk into a studio and not have any plan whatsoever. In fact, I try and actively avoid any sort of structures in that space because I know that the work begins from there and works through. So for that particular work, we improvised in the studio for a couple of hours and then we picked through, found bits we liked, and then sort of expanded from that. And that's kind of a format that I use for virtually every album I've done since 2017, I would say. And as time has gone on, post lockdowns in the act of studio production and editing and producing has become more and more of a sort of key fabric of that, just because I love what's available to me when I work into that sort of space. And I'm not precious about the improvisation thing of like, the artifact itself is the artifact. I feel like once you've recorded it, it becomes its own thing. And, I think we've passed that discussion point in some ways, and there's more things to unpack, I think.
Um, Reuben, I think Neil jumped to one side. Let me jump to the other side a little bit. And I'd invite you to sort of reflect a little bit on your PhD that you're doing at the moment with a focus on contemporary trance practices. And I guess we can both acknowledge that Tony Yap had done his doctorate a couple of years ago on trance as well. But I understand you've got a different focus, and I'd love to know more about, and not only I, but those listening. Let's uh,
Sure.
let's let's know more about where you're going with it, what intrigues you about trance, and how that fits into the broader domain of sound making slash performance slash being in the world, I'm thinking.
Sure, sure, sure. Well, as a precursor, it's worth mentioning that I'm still in the very early stages. I started my PhD last year in 2024, around February, March. We found out we were having twins pretty soon after that, so I went very, very hard on the idea very excitedly until about November, and then I've been on leave ever since. But I think that's sort of beside the point really, because the PhD has been a long time coming. I didn't think it would come this early, but circumstances around my research and where I've landed in my career and my thinking has meant that now is a good time. Um, the title at this point is Holding Space, um, and it's it's coming from yeah, I guess a long collaborative relationship with Tony. And I remember when he started his PhD, I was like, oh, when you finish that document is going to be a incredibly powerful, incredibly relevant, incredibly useful document that will articulate a framework and a fabric of creative practice around me that will be so useful to have. And I know now through the limited academic work that I've done that it's nice to have those kinds of clear bookends and clear sort of you know uh, you know, academic work is different to creative career, expansive open practice. And in a funny way, you're sort of better off bookending it a little bit and making it a little more sterile. Otherwise, you'll get sort of stuck. I started my master's thinking that it would, answer all my questions, and I came out with more questions. So I'm aware of that's the framework. So when I saw Tony start that journey, I just thought, there's something in there which I would love to read and understand and build on. So I've basically done that. So my focus is less about a physical sense of what trance is and more about how those structures can be embodied within more of a sonic space, within more of a curational space, electro-acoustic sound design sort of area. So where I'm coming from is yeah, Tony's framework of the different transfocal points that comes from his lifelong work into trance practice, and I'm mapping that into how I think about my sound design work. My supervisor is Dylan Vanderschiff, who is an incredible improviser academic, and his work is really coming out of cognitive science and coming from embodied cognition, looking at how the brain and physicality sort of match together. He's a beautiful uh, encouraging writer and improviser. So he's got a very different sort of spin on the whole thing as well. My secondary supervisor is Kate Neal, who I think is an incredible composer, and I think her way of putting compositional structures around different mediums is going to help me kind of give some more focus to it, or give me a different provocation, I guess. But yeah, I think for me, it does have a through line from my previous academic work, in the sense that I'm always interested in how my presence and my actions have a very they mean something. If I say something in a room, it has an impact, and if I don't say something in a room, it has an impact, like we all do. So trying to understand how I can deepen that practice and go somewhere else with it is kind of where I'm ending up. So if I'm going to clarify a bit more, this is great, because PhD is such it's a fun space, but it does break your brain in different ways. I think what I'm interested in now is trying to understand how sound can work as an anchor point and as a provocation point for experience. So trance is an interesting area. I'm looking at the Buntingan bull trance practice, which is a practice based in East Java. Agus Rianto is the holder of that particular tradition that I've worked with before. We've collaborated in a few different contexts with Tony, but I want to understand how I can work with those principles in not just sound, but also just creating experiences for people. So it's a very sort of early space, but what I'm loving about it is that as I'm reading and understanding what the academic frameworks are, there's a lot of interesting theory and research coming into this area, which is very fun. So another researcher that I'm loving is Judith Becker. She has a beautiful book called Deep Listeners, which is looking at the cognitive science aspect of trance and emotion and deep listening, and understanding how also community factors, how these things can work together to create different layers of consciousness and different layers of intensity, and how music is she describes it quite often as kind of the arrowhead in an experience. It's one of those sensations that is very direct and can tap into a very particular point of consciousness and a very conscious point of memory. So for me, I'm just exploring things in those areas. One thing I'm noticing more and more as I'm sort of starting to dip my toes into it from a different perspective is that memory and the experiences that I've had over, 10 years of working with Tony, for example, those can be sort of moved around and played with in different ways. So in this interim period, when I'm sort of starting to think about how I would structure it myself, I'm also experimenting with how I provoke Tony in his work, for example. So because I've been building this sort of studio practice for a long time now, I have this sort of very long archive of materials that I've collected over my time improvising and working with Tony and the people, and I'm starting to realize that there's a real just like Dave Brown and his anvil sounds, there's something about these things have potency and a life within them that I can drop into different spaces. So the last time I did a work with Tony, I realized that I would be putting in samples and making sounds that could reference 2015, could remember 2017, could locate someone in Indonesia that we've worked with for a long time. There's all these sort of different points of memory and experience and intensity that I can cue in with Tony, and that will have a sort of a flow-on effect to how the audience experiences as well. So I think that's where I'm sort of beginning to explore, is understanding what the significance is of sound and how I can harness those areas and give them a little more I guess, directed focus. And also I would say that what I'm trying to do in the PhD space, because PhD is a wonderful framework to clarify ideas and take something that is, fuzzy and intuitive and internal into a framework where I have to articulate it, So as you can probably guess, I'm in that sort of fun, fuzzy period where it's all interesting and it's all amazing. And so I think what I'm trying to do here is challenge myself to create new structures and new ways of thinking about these things that I've done for a long time. So I dare say it'll become more structural and compositional at some point.
Why continue to use the term trance
Mm.
in a contemporary context where the meaning starts to sort of broaden and become, I guess, possibly challenged by or enhanced by other concepts? Um, what does trance start to mean?
Yeah, I mean, trance and shamanism are both very, you know, they're spicy words in certain contexts, put it that way. And yeah, part of the work of PhD is to qualify those terms and understand what I'm actually referring to when I speak about those things. So, for me, trance as a term is referring to very specific areas of trance practice. So, what I'm investigating in my PhD specifically is the trance practice of Tony Yap, and his academic work and his historical creative practice, and also the Bantingan trance practice in East Java, and specifically Augusto Riento's journey as a shaman in that space. So, yeah, trance is one of those things where it means so many different things to different people. Quite often I have to sort of qualify that I'm not talking about a trance festival, a bush doof, that kind of stuff. Although, mind you, those things do have connections. I I always think about how I read an interview about John Hassel about 10 years ago where he spoke about how he performs in clubs. He was performing in clubs towards the end of his years because that was one of the few spaces where you could sort of access that sort of deeper, intense listening, intense emotional state within the Western world, So I think it's very important to qualify what trance means. And for me, it's those specific practices. It's Tony Yap and it's the Bunting practice. But acknowledging that as a form, it exists in a whole bunch of different ways and can be used in different senses. So I think that I've started to step away from the word shaman as well, shamanism, because that is also a similar thing where we have different ways of using it and abusing it in the Western world, and misunderstanding what's going on there. But having said all that, they're still very useful terms to have because they do mean something different to just deep listening, or well, not just deep listening, but deep listening is also another phrase that has a very particular connotation. So I think it's important to use trance in this context because it does come from a very long historical community-driven space, and it has a different way of articulating what I'm trying to do. So I may not necessarily want to make trance music, be that a bush doof, be that a trance festival in Indonesia, but there are energetic and community structures and things within that are important to acknowledge and understand. So, yeah, I think that's where I'm coming to with that. And as I'm starting to refine what I'm looking at and investigating from an academic standpoint, it's giving me more clarity in terms of how I bring that into my work. So even simple questions like how would a electro-acoustic sound artist incorporate Tony Yap's 5 transfocal states is a great question to start from. It's never as simple as that, but it's a beautiful provocation to think about in terms of writing, but also in terms of music. And so I'm just on the cusp of being able to start to experiment with those ideas and sort of, bring some very patient, very lovely dancers and musicians in to experiment with.
We pretty much hit the end of the interview, Reuben. But before we go, I wonder if you'd like to take the opportunity we know you're deeply engaged with having twins, and your PhD, but I wonder if you could paint for us where you see the next few years going.
Mm, mm. Yeah, I was saying off mic before that it's a really wonderful time to have a conversation like this because my baby twins are now 5.5 months old, so it's been a very intense, beautiful journey that me and my partner have been on for the last sort of, I guess year really. And at this point in my life, I feel like I've taken all of my creative endeavors and all my creative projects, wrapped them up and got them in a really nice sort of space of conceptual clarity or conceptual robustness, put them on the shelf, and I'll know I'll pick them up when I have the brain space going on. Um, Having said that, I am an organizer. I am I do like to get things together. So I have sort of implemented some things that will mean that I have to pick them up off the shelf sooner or later. So, so for me, it's a beautiful time because I'm at a beginning rather than a midpoint or an ending now. So the PhD is in the early phases, the fun part where everything is possible and everything's great. But for me, that journey will be the next chapter in my solo practice, in my curational practice, in my compositional practice as well. So I think that's going to be the next sort of 3 or 4 years of understanding what that really means. I've hit the point in that research where I started off strong, started off clear. I was like, this is exactly what I'm going to be doing. This is what it's all about. And now I'm realizing that I don't really know anything, which is beautiful. I rarely get to those points. And when you get to them, it's great. So I've hit that point now, and I've hit this real point of vulnerability where I've put in a few developments in the next few months where I have to actually start to experiment here. And I'm actually quite nervous about it now because I realize that I know nothing. So that's one element. My ensemble I hold the lines for is in this beautiful period of time now where it's shifted from being a project that's more or less curated and led by me, and now into more of a band ensemble. So it's a solid quartet of 4 people now. Emily Bennett, Ronnie Farella, and Adam Halliwell. We've just finished the third studio album, so that comes out later on this year on Earshift Music. So I'm very excited about that because it's a new chapter in that work. And on the side of that, we've also been doing a kids touring program as well. We've composed a 60-minute work with Musica Viva Australia in schools, and so we're in the second year of touring that work now. So that will be something that will continue on for the next at least 3 to 4 years, if not more. We've really enjoyed that experience, and having kids brings a whole different level of context to it. And what I'm loving about that particular project is that rather than having to dumb down or sort of clean out improvisational frameworks or concepts or ideas of what we're trying to do, we've actually had to become far more intense about it. We've become really, really focused and really adamant about what improvisation means and what its values are and how to express that to an audience of 5-year-olds. And that's a beautiful space because I feel like the music has gotten stronger and clearer and more intense as a result. So I think the next album must be a kids album just for that very reason. So I think there's a beautiful thing like that. So I think the next couple of years is a new journey for me. It's a new way of taking, I'm also 35, so I'm in that sort of beautiful period where things have started to flatten in a beautiful way. It's given me space to actually slow down a little bit and think clearly and deeply, because now if I want to do something, I have to really make space for it. So I'm kind of enjoying that moment of clarity and vulnerability.
Phew.
It's a lot, but all of our friends say, of course you two would have twins, of all the people.
Thanks very much for conversing with us, Reuben. All the best with this new phase. Kevin?
Reuben, it's been a wonderful opportunity. I feel as though we could continue to speak and unfold this for hours. So thank you so much for being available to us today to delve into the detail of things opening up to broader prospects and not quite knowing where next. How wonderful.
Thank you, Kevin and Neil. It's a real pleasure. And as I said before, it's I think archives are really important, and it's so great to document these moments and to connect to a broader fabric of what you're trying to do with this podcast. These things they may seem humble tasks, but they are monumental, and they are a lot of work. But the yeah, I just think it's very important to acknowledge the work you're doing here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Reuben.
Thank you, Reuben.